Hi, this is Dan from Bible Prophecy and Truth, and I am excited today because we're going to talk about all of prophecy and how it all comes together, and we're going to put it all together in the final end time picture that God painted for us in this video series. If you haven't seen Prophecy Explained, parts 1 and 2, When is the End of the World, the seven trumpets, the seven seals, who is the great whore, the false prophet, and the Antichrist, watch those first, because this is gonna put it all together in the final piece of the puzzle, and all the pictures God painted for us, and all the different prophecies, and all the different ways things, the views into the future that God gave us, they all come together in this final piece of the puzzle. The mosaic that God painted is complete. So if you haven't watched those, feel free to watch this one, but it'll just come together so clearly if you watch the other ones first. So in this study, we're going to look closely at Daniel 2, which is Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It was King Nebuchadnezzar. At the time of Daniel, it was the king of Babylon, and he had a dream, and he couldn't remember the dream, but he knew that it troubled him. So he had all of his wizards and people come and try to tell him what the dream meant, but they're all like, well, tell us the dream and we'll tell you what it meant. But he didn't remember the dream, and he wanted them to tell him the dream and the meaning, and well, nobody could, and so he was going to have them all killed. Daniel was told about this and went to the king and said, well, God can give me your dream and the interpretation, and he did. And this was the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had and the interpretation of it that Daniel showed him. And I encourage you, like I always do, to stop the video and read this scripture right here, or open your Bible and read it and take a look at that. But what the main gist of that is that there's a statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in the dream, and it had 5 sections, and the interpretation of the dream was that these 5 sections represent world dominating powers of the known world from the time of Babylon to the return of Jesus at the last day. And it tells specifically that they're successive kingdoms, that one comes after the other. It says, like, after these shall arise another, and then another after that, and then another. And there's 5 sections. And so this is the picture God painted for us of all the world-dominating kingdoms that exist from Nebuchadnezzar's time, the time of Babylon, to the time of the return of Jesus Christ. And it's so amazing, the revelation that God gave us. And it's the same as Daniel 7 and Revelation and all the Antichrist, and even hooks into that. And you'll see when we get to the end of this, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about and how it all comes together. So if you haven't read that, go ahead and read it. And this is the statue that was painted for us, the picture that was painted for us in the prophecy, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had and the interpretation of it. There was a head of gold, which was Babylon, and Babylon ruled until the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon in 539 BC. And then the silver of the statue was the Medes and the Persians ruled until Alexander the Great defeated them in 331 BC. And then we have the brass, which was Greek kingdom. The Greek Empire lasted until the Romans defeated them in 197 BC. And then we have the iron, which is Rome. And the Roman Empire lasted about 500 years until it decayed from within and was overrun by barbarians around 300 AD. And this was the largest of the empires and controlled most of Europe and some of the Middle Eastern nations. And then the 5th section of the statue is the iron and clay. It was iron mingled with clay, but it doesn't really mix, and it even says that it was broken, partly strong and partly broken and divided, and it said that they didn't cleave to one another. And in 325 AD, Emperor Constantine created the Catholic Church. in an attempt to reunify Rome, because it was falling apart and Rome was splitting up and decaying from within, and barbarians were overrunning it. And so Emperor Constantine glued Rome back together by creating the Catholic Church. And there was, the Western and the Eastern and the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church, and it kind of came all back together under the banner of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD. And it's the same period of time that the Islamic Empire was rising in the Middle East in the 7th century and 8th century, and became the Islamic Ottoman Empire around 1300 AD. So when we look at that, the prophecy and the interpretation of it specifically tells us that this last section that there was two parts to it. It wasn't one kingdom. It was divided, and it was partly strong and partly broken. And the iron and clay didn't mix. They didn't cleave to one another. And I'm going to show you some maps in a little bit to show you how that all happened in history. And then a little more detail, the Holy Roman Empire was founded in 800 AD when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne and proclaimed him to be the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And if you know about the EU today, the European Union is really kind of a continuation of that Holy Roman Empire. They even have a Charlemagne prize, which is awarded every year. It was awarded to Bill Clinton in 2000, and it's awarded to the person that does the most for the reunification of Europe, under the banner of, the Holy Roman Empire used to be called the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, and it was very much a European government, and the EU mirrors that very much today. And then we have the Islamic Empire that began after Muhammad. He created a monotheistic religion, and it spread rapidly among the Arab nations. And it kind of rose and fell many times, just like the European or the Holy Roman Empire rose and fell many times, and so did the Islamic Empire. And it kind of went back and forth, and the Ottoman Empire kind of solidified it and made it strong, and was founded around 1300 AD and actually existed up until the early 1900s. And the modern Arab League mirrors the EU in the same way that the EU mirrors the Holy Roman Empire, in that it's uniting the Muslim nations in the same type of an economic cooperative, but membership is based on the Muslim religion and the Muslim culture rather than geographic locality like the EU is. Now, both of these empires still exist in spirit within the nations they controlled. The EU and the Islamic nations both still kind of mirror that Holy Roman Empire and Islamic Ottoman Empire together. And I'm going to show you some maps. The prophecy specifically says that the iron mingled with clay that follows the Roman Empire, the last king, is the last kingdom that will exist before the return of Christ. So we know that there's not going to be another world-dominating empire until Christ returns. This is the last one. We're not going to see some nation, somebody come and take over the world until it's the Antichrist. The Antichrist is he is going to use this. He's going to combine the EU and the Arab League and combine Islam with Catholicism and join the East and the West together, both politically and militarily and economically and religiously, to create his final world-dominating empire. And when we look at this map, I'm going to show you several maps, and this is a map of the Babylonian Empire. And the thing I'm showing you here mostly is they kind of move around. As you see the empires, they kind of grow and shrink and move around a little bit, but every single one of them controls the area that God is most concerned with, which is Israel and Jerusalem, and that area, that place where God chose to put his name, which is Jerusalem. The Babylonian Empire, you can see, controlled a pretty good size area. And then the Medes and the Persians after him controlled a much bigger area into the Middle East, but the same general area in Israel and that area above it where Turkey is now, and some of that area. And then the Greek Empire, when the Greek Empire, when the Greeks took over, it kind of grew a little bit more and spread out a little bit more, but it was still the same basic area as the Medes and the Persians, just a little bit different. And then the Roman Empire, it controlled that same area in the Middle East with Israel and Syria and what was Mesopotamia back then, and the different areas, but it went all the way into Rome and all the way around the Mediterranean Sea. And it was a huge area controlled by the Roman Empire. And then if you look at the Holy Roman Empire and its reign, you can see that it was largely Germany and Europe that it controlled. Which, if you remember, the fifth part of the statue was divided, and partly strong and partly broken. So that fifth section is the same area that the Roman Empire controlled, but it was divided and it was broken. So the Holy Roman Empire controlled the European nations of today in that area, and the Islamic Empire controlled the other part. Now this is a map of today and the EU. These are the member states of the EU, and you can see how that Deutschland and Italia and France that's the area that was the Holy Roman Empire, and those areas are still, that's the EU today. It's basically the same area. And then if you look at the extent of the Ottoman Empire at its peak was this area, where it's northern Africa, the Middle East, and kind of they were always fighting back and forth in Spain and in southern Europe, and so it kind of went back and forth. But this was the biggest extent of the Islamic Ottoman Empire. And then today the Arab League mirrors that, where it's all of northern Africa and Saudi Arabia and into some of the Middle Eastern nations. So when we look at it combined, this is the EU and the Arab League nations combined today, which is the same area that we're talking about as all of the nations that controlled everything from Babylon to today. Now, Israel is not part of the EU or the Arab League today, and it's never going to be. That's what the confirmation of the covenant that we've talked about in other Bible studies is, where the world as a whole, the United Nations and other nations of the world, are all going to come together and sign a peace treaty defining the borders of Israel, settling the status of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, and that's when the Jews are going to be given permission to rebuild the temple. The third temple is going to be rebuilt on the Temple Mount, and the EU and the Arab League are all going to be part of this big, the world as a whole coming together to sign this agreement. And that's what's going to begin. That's the confirmation of the covenant. That's what's going to begin the final 7 years, that final week of Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. And by a week I mean a week of years, is what it means in the Bible. And these two areas, the EU and the Arab League, are exactly what the Antichrist is going to bring together to reunite and revive the Holy Roman / Islamic Ottoman empires and use that to control the world. That'll be his military power base. So again, when we look at that statue, we see it was Babylon and the Medes and the Persians, then the Greek Empire, and then the Roman Empire, and then the Holy Roman / Islamic Ottoman Empire is that fifth section, which is the feet and the toes of iron mingled with clay, which matches perfectly exactly what's happened. We look back in history, and that's exactly what happened, is that the Holy Roman Empire and the Islamic Ottoman empires controlled the same area as the Roman Empire, but they're divided, partly strong and partly broken, exactly as the prophecy stated it would be. And then when we look at the 10 toes, that's the same representation as the Daniel 7 10 horns of the fourth beast. And we're told specifically that those 10 horns are 10 kings. And the same thing in Revelation 13. All four of those beasts from Daniel 7 are combined into one beast. And the 10 horns are the 10 kings on that fourth beast that is now part of a single beast, where the Antichrist pulls all those nations together to make a political and military power base. And the same thing as Revelation 17. The 10 kings that are mentioned there are the same 10 kings that are the 10 horns and the 10 toes of Daniel. And it's almost an absolute certainty today that this 10 nation union will be 10 Islamic nations who will give their military power to the Antichrist, who will be their Mahdi. And we're going to talk about that in this video series a little bit later in depth. So here's kind of a picture. I've shown you this picture before in other videos, and when we put it all together, and the four horsemen of Revelation, the first four seals that are the same as the four spirits that are released into the world in Zechariah, it shows us how that Islam is that green horse, which is the spirit, the spotted and of a strong color horse that is in the world today, that spirit, and how it's this fourth beast of Daniel 7. And the 10 kings on that fourth beast are the same as the 10 toes of Daniel 2, the 10 kings of Revelation 13, 10 kings of Revelation 17, and it's the clay of Daniel 2 in that fifth section of the statue, where it's the Islamic Empire, which is the fourth beast of Daniel 7, which will, and then in the end, it's going to be reunited by the Antichrist, where he's going to bring all of these things together to create his military, religious, and economic cooperative to take over the world. So that fourth beast of Daniel 7 represents that part of the picture. It's Islam, and it's those 10 kings that give him their power in Revelation 17. And then the bear is represented by communism, and the seal that we talked about, and the spirit that's in the world, which is red, and it's the color of communism, and it's represented by the Russian bear, which is the bear of Daniel 7. And the Modern Nations in the Bible article and the video that I'm going to be doing on that, I'll show you how it's just a shoe-in how these four beasts of Daniel 7 are Russia and Germany and Great Britain and Islam. And that's what we're seeing represented here in this final beast. And we're told in Daniel 7 that all of these beasts are going to exist at the time, and the beasts are kings. It specifically says that they're kings or nations, and the nations that those kings rule, and they're all going to exist at the time Jesus returns. Just like the statue in Daniel 2 is going to be broken apart by the rock that's formed without hands, which is Jesus Christ, and when he returns, he's going to put down the nations of the earth and set up his kingdom, and where it will never be destroyed. And so then the other part of the beast, the lion and the four-headed leopard, represents capitalism, the other seal, and the spirit of Zechariah, that black horse, is capitalism, and it represents the North America and European nations that are capitalistic nations, and specifically these two beasts from Daniel 7, the lion and the leopard, are Great Britain and Germany, which Germany is in its Fourth Reich right now, and it's a four-headed beast, and it's very much representative of Germany, and it's how it's been dominant in Europe. It's just amazing how Germany was cut in half with the Berlin Wall and weakened. And it even said in news articles back then that Germany has been killed and cut with a knife. And since the wall came down, Germany has resurged and is once again dominating Europe. It's just amazing. And the Bible says that this beast, this four-headed leopard beast, was dominant. And it matches so perfectly. And so and then it also matches that iron of Daniel 2, which is the iron part of the iron mingled with clay, the Holy Roman Empire. Because if you remember the map, the Holy Roman Empire was largely Germany and the European nations in that area of the world. So it's the political and military aspect of the union between the Antichrist and the false prophet. As these nations, he's going to pull together with the 10 Islamic nations and Russia to create his military power base to take over the world. And then Catholicism is that white horse, the seal, the spirit that's in Zechariah, that's in the world, that follows the black horse. It represents the great whore of Revelation and the false prophet, which rides on the power of the Antichrist and basically comes into power with him, using him. And they team up and they use each other to gain power over the world. And the false prophet is going to have godlike power, but it's going to come from Satan. That is exactly what it tells us in Revelation 13, that the power comes from Satan himself, even though the false prophet is going to claim that it's from God, that he's pulling fire right out of thin air. He's going to say it's godly power, but it's actually the power of Satan. So this picture here shows us how all of those things come together in this mosaic that God painted for us of all the nations of the world that are going to come in under the Antichrist and be used by him in the end time for his military and political power base, and how the seals that he talked about in Revelation that are the same thing as the spirits in the world in Zechariah, and how they've been controlling the world, and how that all comes together to be the bottom portion of that statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of. And it all just comes together so clearly when you put all of these things together. It's just amazing. So I'm going to stop this video now. This is part 1, and I'm going to continue it in part 2.